I, Dr. Sandeep Kumar, Faculty, Department of Education, University of Delhi, thanks UGC, Human Resource Development Center, Gujarat University, for inviting me and giving me this wonderful opportunity to share my ideas on contextual perspective on cognition, a historical trace. We will complete this theme in two sessions, where session 1 will talk about the historical journey of our understanding of cognition with the help of various perspectives. In second session, we'll discuss extensively about the contextual perspective. So let's start with first session. There are various perspectives available to explain about cognitive functioning, and therefore we have a historical legacy in psychological discourse which has contributed our understanding towards fundamental questions, and that fundamental question is, how do we make sense of our world? This diversity in perspective exists due to their diverse conceptualization of cognition and intelligence, such as cognition as an output of a test, or cognition as a construct towards equilibration, or a processing of information, or coming into being with contextual aspects, and so on. This session helps us to understand the cognitive functioning or intellectual development in a comprehensive manner. The contextual perspective has been traced through historical journey in a conceptualization of cognition and its functioning. Perspectives such as psychometric, Piagetian, Neopiageration, and information processing has also been discussed in brief to establish the need and necessity of contextual perspective. Special focus has also been given to socio-cultural approach to cognition, as it is the most adjoining neighbor of contextual perspective. Essentials of contextual perspective, that is multifacetedness, ever-evolving, environmental representativeness, developmental flexibility, cognition as a semiosis, etc., have also been discussed with suitable and relevant examples, along with logical coherence and consistency. Divergence in views of intellectual development is not restricted to experts, as revealed by investigation of the beliefs children and adults of various ages hold about intelligence. Usein 1981 found that young children believe intelligence consists of physical characteristics as well as the way in which individuals manage specific tasks. Sternberg, Catron, Bernstein, a very famous psychologist, in 1981 found that lay adults see intelligence as a large constellation of behavior reflecting practical problem solving, verbal ability, and social competence. Sternberg found that adults across the lifespan do intelligence as consisting of dimensions such as interest in and ability to deal with, novelty, verbal competence, and everyday competence, among other factors. The diversity present in layperson's view of intelligence matches, if not exceeds, the diversity present in experts' view of intelligence. The five perspectives on intellectual development offered in this session entail different views on how intelligence is formed, maintained, declined, and improves across the lifespan. Even within a particular perspective, often a slightly different focus is adopted by those who use this perspective to study intellectual development during childhood from that adopted by those who use it to study development during adulthood. The differences in view of intelligence result, at least in part, from the perspectives being at different point in development, with some in their relative infancy and some in advanced old age. That is, some perspectives have existed since the inception of formal psychological work on intelligence, whereas others are quite new in their formulation and empirical emergence. These perspectives are also intertwined in that many of them developed in a kind of direct response to perceived inadequacy in other perspectives. the advancement, or we can say the advantages of doing intellectual development from these 5 different perspectives are numerous. The prime advantage is that the picture constructed of what changes with the age is much more complete when viewed from varying perspectives rather than only from single or one perspective. Each perspective affords to deeper look at a particular facet of intelligence. By examining all of these perspectives on intellectual development in one place, we may begin to understand a large piece of puzzle of intellectual development. In addition, search and integration of different perspectives on child and adult intellectual development may be beginning step towards initiating theories of intellectual development that take into account multiple facets of intelligence across the full lifespan. Now it is important to understand how do we understand human development, which also incorporates cognition, is very pertinent question to be explored extensively. Many work has already been done in this domain, and many quality researches also have contributed this discourse. Despite the fact that many theoretical dispositions exist for explaining the aforesaid concept, still it looks incomplete where something essential has not been incorporated. In these theoretical dispositions, we trace the history of intellectual or cognitive development from Plato's time. But here, objective is not to explore this to that old, as it will be a repetition of what already exists. With many experiences and lived practices in the domain of cognitive development, socio-cultural perspective has been accepted by a majority of cognitive theorists. There are many theorists who, with differences in their assumptions, agreed upon the role of context in cognitive development. This perspective is known as contextual perspective. Here, it has been tried to deliberate upon this perspective comprehensively to develop a critical socio-cultural perspective towards intellectual and cognitive development. There are psychological practices which believe that intelligence is what intelligence test measures. This view is associated with psychometric perspective, which is only one perspective out of many existing. Here, in psychometric perspective, cognitive processes were related to sensation, perception, attention, etc. And after that, we have a range of processes representing cognitive functioning, such as reasoning, abstract thinking, problem solving, adaptation, and latest role of socio-cultural and contextual perspective on cognitive development. Different perspectives shared aforesaid have their own ways of explaining the idea of how intelligence and cognition is formed, continued, and expand throughout life. A few of them existed in psychological ages before, and some are relatively recent. And now, contextual perspective is very influential and convincing in the discourse of various branches of psychology. The strength and need of contextual perspective can be understood if we trace it with relation to other perspectives. Therefore, before we trace contextual perspective passing through a historical journey, a brief idea of the views given here will help us to conceptualize and understand contextual perspective in a comprehensive manner. Given perspectives are arranged in a chronological manner or in a chronological way so that we can understand them in an organized manner. These are psychometric perspective, Piagetian perspective, Neopiageration perspective, information processing perspective, and finally contextual perspective. Now let's start discussing about psychometric perspective. Francis Galton's work can be considered fundamental under this perspective because he developed first formal mental test or first formal mental intelligence test in 1880. He tried to relate his work of intelligence with regard to implication of Darwin's theory of evolution. It is important to know that within this tradition, theorists have different assumptions to explain intelligence. Galton worked with physical sensory abilities, whereas Simon Binet was more interested in working with higher order thinking such as verbal comprehension, attention, recalling, reasoning, etc. to work on intelligence. Because Binet was asked officially to develop an intelligence test to separate children who may not be able to perform better in public school education. The prime focus of psychometric perspective was to identify the differences in the nature of intelligence. I would like to repeat this sentence again. The prime focus of psychometric perspective was to identify the differences in the nature of intelligence at various stages of development in an individual's life. Important to note that a specific kind of test was the basis of drawing inferences about intelligence. To analyze the score and see the position of a person on a particular test, statistical methods were used, such as standard deviation, factor analysis, and so on and so forth. This perspective worked to explain the differences in the nature of intelligence at various stages, such as Gardner found that during infancy, perceptual and motor intelligence abilities are more prominent to locate the individual differences, whereas during childhood and also adulthood, abstract reasoning, mathematical ability, visual reasoning, etc. become more prominent and important to identify these differences. Overall, psychometric perspective was more based on test score, which can be interpreted on using statistical measurement to locate and identify the differences between individuals at particular stage of human development. Three basic assumptions underline the psychometric approach. First assumption says the nature of intelligence and intellectual development can be fruitfully studied by examining individual differences in performance on task. Psychometric is not same as experimental psychology. Experimental psychologists perform true experiments, whereas psychometric research deal with correlation of data. Their interest lies in determining the rank ordering of individuals and the stability of that rank ordering from one task to the next. If several tasks display the same rank ordering of individuals, they may indicate a single underlying ability. Second assumption says mathematical techniques such as factor analysis can inform us about the structure of mental ability. Psychometricians have developed sophisticated statistical techniques known as factor analysis to reduce large table of correlation to some smaller number of underlying dimensions of variability known as factors. These techniques are developed to help discover the structure of mental abilities. Third assumption says the development of assessment instruments for measuring intellectual performance is the important a goal as building theories of intelligence. Because psychometric always had a pragmatic side, developing assessment instruments has been on an equal footing with theory building. A major goal of the psychometric approach is to order individuals according to their various abilities. These data can then be used to solve practical problems such as selecting personnel and determining eligibility for special services. Conceptions of intelligence within the psychometric approach are best understood by the history of their development, which is traced here. Theories have differed considerably in the number of mental ability posited as well as their organization. In particular, there has been a tension between theories that have proposed a single overarching general intelligence and those that have proposed multiple ability to the exclusion of general intelligence. Some theories or theorists have resolved this conflict by proposing a hierarchical ordering of abilities, including both general and specific abilities. A second conflict regards nature of test that best measures intelligence. Some psychologists believed that the best way to understand the mind was to analyze it into simpler components. They were of the opinion that intelligence could best be measured by test of physical abilities and the abilities to make simple sensory discrimination. The hope was that these more atomistic measurements could not combined, to yield an index of the complex concept of intelligence. Other psychologists believed a more direct approach was appropriate. To measure a complex mental characteristics such as intelligence, one should measure complex mental operations such as judgment and reasoning. After psychometric perspective, let's discuss a little bit about Piagetian perspective. It is useful to begin this discussion with the question, why has Piaget's theory, despite all the criticism it has evoked, continued to fascinate theorists and researchers? The answer, I believe, is that this theory represents or presents a major intellectual movement in this century. Since the beginning of philosophy, our intellectual tradition has upheld a particular ideal of human nature, one in which criteria of mature conduct are served and dissociated from organic forms. In contrast, Piaget asserts a view on the human organism and its mental equipment as part and parcel of the organismic and biological world. The assertion that our mature capacities are part of the organismic world may sound rather obvious at first blush. Nevertheless, on the background of past views of the mind, it is, in fact, a quite revolutionary view. Its uniqueness is best appreciated if it is compared to past view of the mind. Those views rose with the birth of Greek philosophy, when over several centuries a new way of speaking about such concepts as self, mind, reality, culminating in the writing of Plato's work in the 4th century BC. Piaget believes the role of biological maturation and social experiences in the development of cognitive abilities. Biological maturation represents the ability of a person to perform certain tasks on the maturation of biology. For example, writing with a pencil. One cannot write before fingers are biologically mature to hold a pencil. Once a child becomes able to perform the task relatively perfectly associated with particular biological development and engage with that task time and again, helps a child to develop meaning out of it. Simple repetition of these tasks is called activity. But when a child is able to make meaning out of these activities, that becomes the social experience of a child. During the process of developing these meanings, a child faces many disequilibrations. But with the help of assimilation and accommodation, a child relates and creates equilibration and generates meaning out of these interactions. In adolescence, Piaget claims the unilateral relationships of constraint give way to one of reciprocal exchanges and cooperation. A good example of such exchange is that of a peer group. In such a relationship, rules are no longer understood as coming from some outside authority or agency. Rather, they are created from within the group. Ideally, Piaget says they are being co-constructed or constructed cooperatively among a group of individuals equal in power. In such a setting, there is continuous comparison, opposition, discussion, and mutual control. This way, the new orientation of knowing is autonomous based on the recognition of both one's individuality and that of other member in the group. Thus, for Piaget, increasing levels of cognitive development involves also the restructuring of power relations. Indeed, cognitive development implies that the process of decision making decoupled from conventional structures of authority and instead subordinated under processes accessible to every individual. In this way, a more lasting equilibrium of rationality motivated laws is substituted for the coercive quasi-equilibrium of social power and conversion. Finally, Piaget also asserts that mental operations are continuous with the emotional and imaginative realms. Thus, he rejected the reductionism that would claim that emotions are the cause of cognition, or alternatively, that would make cognition the cause of emotions. Instead, Piaget thinks of the two rather as two sides of the coin. Cognition provides the structure and emotions provides the dynamics and energy. As the individual develops, the two develop in essential interdependence. Initially, Piaget was working with Simon and Binet, but gradually registered his discomfort with their test-based explanation of intelligence, which declared a child into binaries, that is 0 or 1, or we can say fail or pass. Piaget examined the responses given by children in detail and said that reasoning represents different ways, that is qualitative in nature, of thinking at different stages. How does universal changes takes place in cognitive working at different stage of life till adolescence was the basic and fundamental question Piagetian perspective was trying to explore. Important to note that Piaget was looking intelligence as a process of construction of meaning while interacting with environment. This interaction develops cognitive structures to understand the world around and develops in a particular stage of development. Equilibration with the help of assimilation and accommodation between existing cognitive structures and everyday new experiences is the baseline of considering intelligence as a tool in this process. Piaget said in 1952, I quote, "Intelligence is the form of equilibrium towards which the successive adaptation and exchange between the organism and his environment are directed." I unquote. Keeping this idea in mind, Piaget proposed 4 stages of cognitive development, named as sensory motor stage, pre-operational stage, concrete operational stage, and formal operational stage, which is very known to all of you. Important to note that Piaget looked similarities in cognitive reasoning. Now I am focusing on this point, which is different from the psychometric perspective. Piaget looked similarities in cognitive reasoning among children to form a stage, which was different from earlier explanation, which looked differences about the individual abilities while explaining intelligence. The ability of equilibrium a child develops when he or she reaches to adolescence, that is stage of formal operation. Therefore, Piaget did not work or talked much about intellectual development after formal operational stage, that is the stage of adolescence. Piaget also called his view constructivism because he firmly believed that knowledge acquisition is a process of continuous self-construction. That is, knowledge is not out there external to the child and waiting to be discovered, but neither it is wholly performed within the child, ready to emerge as a child develops. Instead, knowledge is invented and reinvented as the child develops and interacts with the world surrounding him or her. Piaget believed that children actively approach their environment and acquire knowledge through their actions and interactions. Moreover, such actions are neither random nor aimless. Very young infant, for example, immediately suck upon any object placed in their mouth, and they mouth objects as a way to learn about their world. Piaget called these goal-directed action schemes and contended that schemes evolves as child develop. This is an ever-happening process in the life of a child. After discussing about Piagetian perspective in brief, now let's discuss a little bit about Neopiageration perspective. As the name suggests, this perspective came into existence in relation to Piaget's work. The basic frame of Neopiageation was to address the criticism raised to Piaget's explanation of cognitive development and extension of his ideas. According to Siegler in 1996, while doing this, Neopiagetion were consistent with two basic ideas. First, at a particular stage of development, child thinks in unidirectional about any given thing, and second, identifying and recognizing that how children think in a particular age should be the aim of any cognitive developmental theory. Considering thinking as information processing makes Neopiagetians different from Piagetian perspective. It implies that theorists favoring Neopiagetion perspective believe on the information that children represents, the process used for transmission of information, and the memory limits that constrain the amount of information they can represent and process. Neopiagetion theory was born in response to general categories of criticism, that is, to the criticisms raised by empiricists, rationalists, and socio-cultural scholars. What Neopiagetion theorists attempted was, first, to preserve those aspects of Piagetian theory which give it a breadth, a widerness, comprehensiveness, coherence, and explanatory power. Second, to develop further those aspects of the theory that seemed incomplete. And third, to alter those aspects of theory that made it difficult to operationalize empirically or suggested that a growing child is insensitive to its physical and cultural environment. Different Neopiagetion theorists, of course, made different decisions and discussions regarding which element of Piaget's theory to retain, which to develop further, and which to alter. Nevertheless, there was a good deal of commonality in the general direction they pursued. Thus, after 20 years of writing and research, it is now possible to specify a set of postulates on which Neopiagetion theorists generally agreed upon. Let us talk about these postulates in brief. There are three such postulates of Neopiagetion theory which are important to discuss here. First, postulates retained from the classic Piagetian system. There are 5 sub-postulates under this category. First, importance of children's cognitive structures. It means children do not simply observe the world around them and note its regularities. Rather, they actively assimilate the world to their existing cognitive structures. Second sub-postulate talks about the role of a child's own activity in creating such structures. Children's cognitive structures at any age are not merely a product of their empirical experiences. They are product of the children's attempt to organize that experience in a meaningful and coherent fashion. Third sub-postulate is universal uniqueness of structural levels. 3 or 4 general levels of cognitive structure can be identified in children's intellectual development. Although different Neopiagetion theorists label and analyze these structures somewhat differently, they all agree that there is a preliminary stage in which sensory motor structures predominate, followed by 2 or 3 further stages in which children's intellectual structures become increasingly symbolic and abstract. Fourth sub-postulate is hierarchical inclusion of earlier structure in later one. The increasingly abstract structures of later stages built on and yet transform those of earlier stages. Thus, for example, the higher order conservation concept possessed by elementary school children, although they are quantitatively and qualitatively different from those possessed by infants. Rather, they are based on these concepts and constitute a higher order reworking of them. The characteristic stages for acquisition of structures at different level is the 5th sub-postulate. The final assumptions that has been retained from Piagetian theory is that characteristics age range may be identified for the acquisition of structures at any of the major level specified by the theory itself, providing that subjects are exposed to what might be termed an optimal environment. Second category of postulates extend the classic Piagetian system. There are three sub-postulates under this category. First, development and learning are distinguished. In the classic Piagetian system, development is said to involve a transformation or accommodation of a child's existing structural framework, while learning is said to be involved in assimilation of new content to an existing structural framework. Virtually all Neopiagetion theorists have maintained some sort of distinction from this sort of and have sought to explicate in greater detail the process that underline each form of change. Second, developmental restructuring presumed local in nature. A second Neo-Piagetian notion that involves an extension of the classic position is actually one of which Piaget's position evolved over a period of time. In his best work known, which was done in his middle years, Piaget spoke of the processes of structural transformation as though they operated on the entire system of structures in the child's repertoire. In his later work, however, he preferred the notion that such processes operate on one particular class of a subgroup of such structures at a time in a dynamic fashion. It is the later position that has been adopted by Neo-Piagetian theorists. Third postulation, cyclic recapitulation of structural sequence hypothesized. The third notion of Piaget's that Neo-Piagetian theorists have attempted to extend is the idea that there is a cyclic recursion through substages at each general stage or level of development. Important to note that this idea was already existing in Piaget's work, but Neo-Piagetian has extended this work further. Let us now discuss about the postulates in third category. Postulate in this category has three segments. Now we will talk about three sub-postulates under this category. These postulates will be related to alter the classic Piagetian system. First, cognitive structures redefined. In most Neo-Piagetian systems, children's cognitive structures are not defined or described in terms that involve symbolic logic. Rather, they are defined in terms of their forms, their complexity, and their level of hierarchical integration. Second, role of maturation in determining upper limit hypothesized. The second postulate in this group is that specifiable biological factors regulate the gradual shift in this upper limit with age. Although different theorists have modeled these biological factors in different fashions, their proposals are by and large complementary and quite unified in the overall view they provide. Third, importance of individual differences stressed. Third postulate is that individual differences must be taken into account both in modeling the process of structural transformation and modeling the ease with which different subjects can apply their existing structures within particular domain. As a result, different individuals may often follow different developmental micro-pathways. That is how the prime focus of Neo-Piagetian was to the logical nature of cognitive structures used by explaining cognitive functioning. Also, it tried to revisit his universal claims with regard to local or contextual perspective. Many ideas of Piaget theory have been extended, like one can see Roby Case's work in 1984 and 1992. He has proposed model of memory capacity and uses in two stages of development. So, out of many postulates, the given three are more important on which Neopiageation works. First, applying cognitive structures locally. Second, identifying diversity in applying these cognitive structures. And third, which is final, correlating cognition with emotionality. Now with this understanding, we can move ahead to understand the information processing perspective. Lachman and Butterfield in 1980, Stenberg in 1983, and Miller around 1960 have contributed to this perspective, and now there are different models of information processing perspectives. Important is to note that this approach was a clear critique of classical learning approach, which consider observable output as final learning and a representation of intelligence. This perspective focuses on the exploration of the process which produces the cognitive output, which means what actually happens between input of information through senses and output, which means input, processing, and then output. What happened to the information during processing is the basic and fundamental question information processing perspective search for. According to Cynthia Berg, 1993, I quote, "The information processing perspective characterizes the process between input and output in terms of mental process, representation, assessing knowledge, strategies, executive processes that monitor the system, and the availability of resources needed for this process. The information processing perspective characterizes human thought as akin to the way in which computers access and process information." I unquote. After knowing the basic assumptions, postulates, theoretical dispositions of psychometric perspective, Piagetian perspective, Neopiageration perspective, and information perspective, now we are in better position to understand the idea of contextual perspective in detail, which we will be discussing in next session. Thank you for listening me. I'll meet you in next session. Goodbye.